who we did an hour-long interview with. In fact, I think we did 2 different interviews because we enjoyed the first one so much we went back for a second bite. And thank you, Brian, for both your public service, but also for giving up your time to talk to us today. We really appreciate it.
Great. Just confirming you can all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Well, great. Thank you to Ed and the entire team. Ed made one of the favorite errors that I always love when people make in referring to me as the chair of the National Economic Council, because that happens to be in our system, the president. And so I'll take it. I'll take it for the moment. I want to congratulate you all on a very useful, thoughtful product, both in the output and also in the research method that you employed, and for inviting me to offer a couple of comments. I'm going to offer a couple of reflections on things I would double down on or foot stomp in the analysis, a couple of places where I would quibble, and then a couple of reflections on what it means for the UK. Before I do so, I do have to note that this conversation does run the risk of falling prey to the "other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play" test, meaning that we are right now today in the process of running the most significant natural experiment in economic policy in the United States in the history of our country. And it is worth just noting that I think when this analysis was conceived at the end of the year last year, just how different a place we were in than we were now. So we can, of course, debate and take lessons from Bidenomics, and I am probably not objective, but certainly believe that this is worthy of study. But just to put this conversation in perspective, at the end of last year, there was an emerging consensus around, independent of the question of a policy's contribution, that the American economy was in a truly exceptional place. Because Martin is on the panel, the FTs wrote in December that America's economy is soaring ahead of its rivals. The Economist had the headline that the American economy is the envy of the world. And basically, that was an emerging consensus. Between then and now, over the course of a breathtakingly short period of time, we've gone from real GDP projections of 2% to 0%. We've gone from the likelihood of recession at 15% to 60%. We've gone to core PCE in 2025 from 2 to 3. Consumer sentiment in the U.S. has fallen by roughly 25%, the largest fall over a short period of time in the history that we've been measuring it in the U.S. 1-year forward inflation expectations has gone from 2.5 to 5. And small business optimism has fallen at its fastest rate on record as well. So we find ourselves in the middle of a reverse policy experiment that I certainly fear, for one, may have a more lasting impact on the American economy than anything else. But we were also here to study that moment in time of history. So I won't belabor that, other than to say I think that the one lesson is that real thought, study, and orientation around the first and second and third order impacts of fiscal policy in the U.S. and trade policy in the U.S. is needed, and needed more than ever, as we ourselves go through this experiment in policy adventurism in the U.S. Okay, 2 things that I would reinforce in the findings from this paper. The first is on dynamism. I think this has been underappreciated, and the paper makes an admirable contribution. I would raise that in addition to the elements of that the paper raised, the level of small business and new business formation in the United States surprised us as policymakers in 2023, 2022, 2023, and 2024 and 2024. Those 3 years were the highest 3 years of small business creation on record. And what that means is new applications, individuals in the U.S. Filing an application for a new business. Now, most of those in the United States actually fail. Most people who actually file a new business application fail. But there is a incredibly hopeful and dynamic sense at which when you get those applications to go high, because it means people are taking that risk. And I think that's something that we saw quite markedly coming out of the pandemic and has been underappreciated. This paper does a good job at recognizing that. The second is that what was distinct about our industrial strategy during this period, which was a bipartisan effort, to be clear, was not a fundamental change in economic paradigm, but in the willingness to be aggressive and affirmative in doing so. I will always remember Senator Todd Young, a Republican from Indiana, saying to me, and I think he doesn't appreciate that I quote him on this, but saying what we need in America is an active and energetic industrial strategy, but we don't need to rewrite history. And in fact, our approach was quite grounded in America's history of active industrial strategy dating back to the beginning of the Republic and Alexander Hamilton. Okay, 3 things I would quibble with modestly with the paper. The first is there is some conflation between politics and economics. I think the authors recognize this in some of the collective therapy that they were doing with people. But on the economics, on the big question of kind of was the fiscal stimulus early in the administration too large or too small, there is an economic consensus that at the outside edge, the incremental impact of the fiscal stimulus added somewhere between a quarter to a half point and 2 points to inflation, and economically that is nowhere near a majority of the inflation and nowhere even near a sort of a plurality of the inflation that the U.S. experienced. Put differently, the U.S. would have seen a historically large inflation shock independent of whether the American Rescue Plan passed or not. That's on the economics. There's a lot of debate about the politics, about what the political implications of that would be. And my only quibble with the paper is if you want a good answer to the question of whether or not that incremental margin of inflation affected the U.S. outcome of the election, you didn't survey the right people. None of us is actually particularly well equipped to make that political judgment. And so as someone who is an economic policy professional who is often asked to play political pundit, I think that is an important distinction to make. Okay, number 2, I think that even as you recognize the increase in construction manufacturing, there was an insufficient appreciation of the historic nature of the surge in private investment in the US. And I think this has important implications for the UK. It wasn't just manufacturing construction, though that is certainly worth emphasizing, and you do in the hockey stick chart. It was also that you look and you saw a clear line from the certainty and stability of incentives that were passed in the United States, particularly in the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, and the surge in private investment, not just in in construction activity, but manufacturing activity. $400 billion in pledged investment for the semiconductors, more than $600 billion in private investment in energy. We've seen booms of new nascent industries in private investment, hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration, nuclear in the United States, where we've seen 7 to 10x increases in private investment over this period. All of this happened in a very high interest rate environment, and you saw a very high return of $5 to $6 of private investment for every $1 of public capital deployed. And I think that speaks to the power of stable, long-term, technology-neutral incentives in areas of economic and geopolitical, politically significant. Frankly, if Ronald Reagan had gotten this kind of supply-side response to his tax cuts, he would have immediately gone down and built a monument to himself on the Washington Mall. And that kind of private investment response is, I think, in some ways what the UK should think about in this context. Third quibble is I think there was a bit of an insufficient openness and curiosity about the intersection between Bidenomics and productivity. It is, of course, true over a long stretch of time that the US has outpaced the UK. But if you go to your own chart and you look at the very end, there is an increase in the rate of productivity in the United States since the pandemic, which is certainly requires much more study. But basically, the US was running at between 1 and 1.5% productivity over the 20 years prior to the pandemic and has been running above 2% since. I think there's reason to believe, or at least be curious, that full employment matters for productivity. Promoting private investment in areas of high private economic return matters for productivity, and that those things are actually connected economically as well. Quickly, then, just reflections for the UK. I think all of this boils down to I think the recommendations are well stated, and it's the area where I'm the least well positioned to offer you all advice. I do think that it should cause the UK, particularly in the moment that we are in, and in the new era of where the US is making economic policy decisions, is to be more willing to take more risk in an active and energetic industrial strategy. Those incentives need to be stable. They need to be technology neutral. They need to be oriented toward driving private investment. But I think the lesson is that capital is craving those types of stable, neutral incentives. And when in sectors that you have a comparative advantage or a geopolitical rationale, that you can have quite a high return. And that an industrial strategy for the UK should involve more promote and less deny. Meaning, I think the paper does a nice job of trying to encourage drawing a distinction between a energetic industrial strategy and protectionism. And those two things are different in type and different in kind. But an industrial strategy designed toward encouraging private investment and building capability does not actually need to be coupled with an equally adventurous strategy on the deny side as well. So with that, let me pause, turn back to you all, and I'll be curious to hear others' thoughts as well.
Thank you so much, Brian. I think your quibbles, we actually, if we talk for half an hour, we could get to a consensus. Because I have a lot of sympathy with everything that you are saying. All I would say on the inflation point, even on the economics, of course, it's contested. We were talking with Larry last night, who has a very different view of the 2 percentage point inflation, it being a small part as an argument. We decided that it wasn't really our role to arbitrate, and therefore what we wanted to do was reflect the debate which we tried to do. But on the dynamism point, it's so striking, the American experience, and it was very striking to us doing the work and talking to you and others. It was clear that back at the beginning of the administration, when the pandemic was raging, you were very worried about the fact that the US was taking a very different approach to the approach being taken in Britain and Europe, where we essentially used public money to keep people in jobs. We furloughed and spent a huge amount of money on that. And the US didn't do that. People said to us it wasn't possible to do that. You were worried about not doing that. The big spike in unemployment was very different from our and the European experience. When you look back, would you do things differently, or would you actually do what you did on the grounds that, in retrospect, the American approach to allowing the labour market to rip, both with job destruction and then job creation, turned out to be a much better way to handle the pandemic than the way that it was done in Britain and Europe?
Yeah, look, if I could go back and I had the power to design policy absent political constraints, the thing that I would do would be to optimize for what we call automatic stabilizers in the US, but take a more US-centric approach than a European approach on that dynamic. Meaning, I think that the ideal outcome is actually to provide support at the household balance sheet level in the way that the US response did. But ideally have that built into the process, built into that more mechanically, so that you have to rely less on the political system to either overshoot or undershoot in magnitude. So on the top line, yes, I think that the value of actually cushioning the negative reaction, not by trying to hold people in place in the labor market prior to the crisis, but on the other hand, provides support and stability at the household level, so that we come through the crisis with the consumer balance sheet being strong as opposed to being derogated, was a powerful combination from a dynamism perspective. And the more we can shift those things to be in the automatic stabilizer category as opposed to legislated and litigated in the moment, the better. That's easier said than done in the political arena. And one of the things that policy people can agree on more and political people usually disregard is the idea of enacting countercyclical automatic stabilizers in periods of calm, because there's no political dividend for doing so. So I recognize that, but that in the ideal world, I think that that's the tweak that you make to sort of say America Prime as the the ideal version of that.
I mean, that is so interesting and so counter to, I think, the way many of us have thought about this before, even counter to the way that some of your colleagues were thinking about it in 2021. It's a really
Yes.
important, challenging lesson. I know you've got to go. Just one other, actually, two questions. In the paper, you talk about Britain as a much smaller economy with much less fiscal firepower. You talk about the importance of prioritisation, and I wonder whether that is in industrial policy, whether that you felt less constrained to prioritise. Do we need to more? And then Dan also made the point about catharsis and presentation, in which, I mean, a good story ended up not being told in a way which was politically effective. And you said you were an economist in the Economic Council, but let's be honest, at the heart of the centre of politics. And so on that second point, on the lesson you learn about the storytelling on the economy.
Yeah. So I think, well, let me take your second point first, which is that I take away two things on storytelling on the economy. The first, inflation is politically toxic, and regardless of how inflation comes about, almost any incumbent that has to explain or defend inflation is almost always losing. I think we're going to see the current president in the US suffering with the same issue, where trying to blame inflation on anything, if you're the incumbent, is very difficult to an American public with a sour mood. And so that, from a political standpoint, reinforces the political risk of inflation. The second, though, I think is a more optimistic view, which is if you look back on the major policy initiatives that America has undertaken over the past 30 or 40 years, be it large tax reform and tax cuts among Republican presidents or the Affordable Care Act, healthcare expansion, none of those have become politically popular among the American public inside of 5 years. And I think there's a sort of logical intuition around this, which is the American public is intuitively skeptical of whether benefits will sustain to them across time. And so you almost always need to sustain political cycles to build political support. And that political support generally comes when those things are threatened or threatened to be taken away. So if you look at political support for the combined industrial strategy embedded in the IRA and CHIPS and the like, they're actually more politically popular than almost any of these initiatives at this point in time. Now, we've seen a big change in political leadership in the US, but I actually am cautiously optimistic on that front. On the last point about being constrained, and I just want to put this in perspective, notwithstanding the historically significant effort we took with industrial strategy, the combined fiscal impact of those three pieces of legislation is roughly somewhere between 0.5% and 0.75% of GDP a year over a 10-year period. That's somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the size of the 2017 tax cuts, and probably 15 to 20% of the size of the tax bill that's currently being debated in the United States. So from a fiscal perspective, I would argue that our industrial strategy, while historically much larger than what we've undertaken in the US, was still constrained, and I would argue value for money from a fiscal perspective. But I also think that prioritization is key to making industrial strategy work effectively, period, and stop. And that is particularly true for an economy like the UK. And so I think that prioritization, not only in the macro, but also in the micro of how you design these policies, becomes incredibly important.
Brian, I know you've got to go. You've actually gone over the time. Just ask everybody to thank Brian for being with us today. Appreciate it. And we're going to kind of go to our panel here, and I'm going to we'll put the lessons up in case people forget what they are. But let's talk about, first of all, I think I'd like to talk about three things. I'd like to talk about your reflection on America, whether we're right to pull out this dynamism point as being the untold story, and then also because it's a big part of what the government is now talking about, the right way to think about industrial policy and what the US teaches us, but also, as Martin, I'm sure will say, whether or not actually it's possible to draw lessons from one such different place as America. But first of all, let's start with you, Martin. Just on the US, first of all, 4 years of the Biden administration, and then they lost.
Yes, well, that's obviously, from Brian's point of view and a few other people, rather disappointing. I think I wanted them to succeed. So I thought it's very disappointing, mainly because, let's be back clear, I really didn't want this guy back, because I think he's mad, bad, and dangerous. And I think and I've been saying this since he first emerged. And so I really wanted them to win, but they didn't. It was actually very close, it is worth noting. 1.5 percentage points, which is not a landslide, though this American system tends to magnify it, particularly if it's a Republican who's ahead. Why did they lose? My guess is, along with everybody else, it's not because this failed, because pretty clearly on any normal measure, historic measure of performance of the economy in real terms against outcomes, it was disappointing. But performance in the economy in real terms was very strong. No doubt about that at all. Better than I'd expected. So I think essentially two things went wrong, which are the ones that you've been touching on. One you didn't touch on. Basically, the Democratic Party is a ridiculous shambles, and first allowed a man who was undeniably unfit to continue on the assumption that he would be a competent president way into his 80s. That shouldn't have been allowed. And because they didn't plan for that, they ended up with a vice president who became the candidate whom actually nobody really wanted. Now that's a really, if you think, as they constantly told you, this is an existential election, then this is just about as incompetent politically as you can possibly imagine. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is obviously inflation. There are three theories of inflation, probably all three of which have some validity. One, there was a big monetary screw up, which I believe as a major element. Second, there was an overexpansion fiscally. And third, things happen after you get shocks like this. They were very big shocks. And that obviously was a large part of it. So there was a sort of element of bad luck. In other words, they ended up in a position they didn't imagine. I'm in that context, I'd only add one point, your discussion just now about the lessons from what they did in the pandemic. I wrote on the pandemic on a sort of almost more than a weekly basis. Everybody now thinks that we could have known then what was going to happen, but we didn't. I mean, I'm absolutely furious with all the people who seem to think that, in March, April, May, June, July, August, September, everybody ought to have known exactly what was going to happen. If it actually, the pandemic had been much worse, as it might have been, or it had gone on for 3 or 4 years, as it might have, I think these choices between these different regimes might look very different. I would suggest that the Americans did what they did because that's what they could do. They couldn't have done a furlough. It would have been impossible. And they lucked out because actually treating it as an unemployment shock was actually turned out to be very sensible because it was so sensationally quick. in its ending, which they didn't respond to quickly. So I would suggest we don't overplay that.
Great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come second to Andy on the dynamism point, and then third to Shriti on industrial policy. But just for the other two of you, just on the on America, first of all, anything to add to what Martin said or to disagree with?
Say that the one thing I learned in my time in government is that in politics the counterfactual is impossible to prove.
Yes.
It doesn't really matter whose fault it was and what it was. It was just, this is how it is. If you've got inflation, price of eggs, everybody's affected.
Yeah, of course.
Jobs, small population affected. So that's how it works. Financial crisis, don't care if it's global, don't care if it's anything else, don't care if we went into it with a tiny structural deficit. It's not. That's who it is. COVID going to, it created a mess. The government's to blame. It's just how it works. So in one sense, we can sort of quibble about a lot of things. I mean, I particularly agree with Martin's first point about, the ineptness of having somebody who's clearly not fit to govern. I think the other thing about what would be interesting for me is if you looked at this creative destruction point after the financial crisis, because there was a sense this time around these companies were just simply not flowing. It was just an external shock. There it is, happened. During the financial crisis, when we looked at it, I don't know if you recall, Ed, there was a sense that credit had been too cheap, and there were some of these companies who ought to have failed, and why were they succeeding? So there was some level of discernment, although I don't think our response was possible to be so differentiated. And whether we did the same thing, and whether we had a sort of level of survival, and then also to look at labour market participation afterwards. Because we do have a problem that we carry on talking about people not going back to work at this point, and how would it have worked if we hadn't had the furlough scheme? And that is important as well.
Andy, I'm going to get you to take us into the second point. So to reflect upon America, but then also go to, I don't think we're drawing out a lesson on the macro, but we draw out a big lesson on dynamism.
Yeah.
I remember you writing a piece, I think it was in the FT last year, where you looked at, there was an OECD index which measures dynamism and churn in the labour market, in the economy, sorry. And you pointed out that since the financial crisis, the numbers for all OECD economies had been lower. But clearly America then substantially diverges from that in 2020 in I think in an unexpected way, and I think outside of the US and in a not fully understood way. And we say here, for us, consistent with our approaches and our institutions, don't lose sight of the fact that flexibility and dynamism in the way the labour market works is really, really important. So take us from your reflections on America into that lesson for the UK.
Happy to, evening everyone. Nice to see you, and congrats on the paper. It's fantastic, and I think, despite events of the last week, remains as if not more relevant now as then. Ed, I'm sure we'll get onto that later on. US very briefly. I mean, I'm echoing really what Shriti and Martin had to say. Fiscal policy was over-egged. Monetary policy was too leaden-footed. But nonetheless, my judgment would be that even if fiscal and monetary policy had been immaculate in their execution, that cost of living shock would have been very material, and the Democrats would have counted a cost of the ballot box that would probably have cost them the election off the back of it. On which basis, I think net, certainly on the economics of this, Bidenomics was a rip-roaring success. If you'd said to me, we will generate an extra 12 or 13 million jobs at the price of a percentage point or two on inflation, I'd have bitten your hand off way back then. Had you said we'd have reversed that trend of flatlining real median incomes in the US off the back of this, I'd have bitten your hand off. If you'd said in reverse, there's 40 years of widening wage inequalities, I'd have bitten your hand off. So for me, net, this is plainly in the credit rather than debit column. Economically, political judgment is for others. I think the most interesting part of a very interesting paper of yours is around that dynamism point. And that's in part, of course, because including in the US, the story pre-COVID had been one of diminished dynamism.
It had.
By which I mean lower rates of job market churn, destruction and creation, and lower rates of firm entry and exit as the flip side of that. And those material downshifts in both of those, we're talking between a quarter and a third diminution. Until this unexpected nasty comes along in the form of COVID. And those very different models of insurance, jobs versus incomes kick in rather unexpected ways. We might think of high levels of unemployment insurance as perhaps being bad for the jobs market, to encourage people to stay out rather than move in. Hysteresis. And yet this flips round in a world of diminished dynamism in the jobs market. So all of a sudden, that firmer underpinning provides just the motivation needed to get people moving between jobs. And that ends up being the engine of job and productivity creation. The only way to get a pay rise, it turns out, is by moving job. I wish I'd known that before I spent 32 years at the Bank of England. But better late than never.
So, Andy, are you saying that that is one of the root causes of the widening gap in productivity that we saw in one of the early charts?
Well, I mean, that gap predates COVID, but was given, for me, judging by Ed's and the team's analysis, a significant further kicker by events during COVID. COVID further dulled the senses and added to risk aversion among businesses, consumers, and governments. And the US bucked that trend, in part because its government shouldered much more risk. But off the back of that, as Brian said, that then crowded in greater risk taking by both workers as they move between jobs and by businesses due to both startups and indeed through increased private investment, as Brian made out. So that, for me, is the single biggest, and in some ways, Ed, most surprising lesson from this episode, because it turns on its head.
It does.
Much of what we thought previously about the role of actually not just unemployment insurance, but also sick pay insurance as well.
If you're telling the government what that means in the UK, they should be doing.
Well, it translates into a much greater generosity when it comes to unemployment benefits.
Right.
And sick pay.
High tolerance.
Of people moving jobs.
Yeah.
Martin?
On the
dynamism point.
I don't think I have anything to add on the labour market side, except for the question, because that on the US, it clearly was very beneficial, except to ask, what will we need to do? What would European countries more broadly, but certainly what will Britain need to do to create that sort of dynamism? How much of it, and I just don't hear this word, for instance, how much of that movement of jobs involve movement of location? Yeah. And my guess, this is a guess, that in much of the United States, that will be much easier than it now is here, because our housing market, for reasons we know so well, is so completely ossified. And and I mean, I presume most of these people weren't moving to New York, as it were. They were moving within similar areas in a vast country, in large parts of which there's surplus housing.
Right.
So what makes the dynamism work and how relevant that is to us with our particular situation is something I would really like to know. How much of it is the other side is why have we got this relatively low participation rate, and which was sort of ossified again since what is it about this, or is it in fact about incentives in our welfare system, which the US is that crucial, or is there something else? I think we need to know, but I do accept completely. And then the final question is, if running the labour market hot is crucial, that obviously has implications crucially for macro policy. A central bank that has just been devastated by a massive inflation overshoot is not going to be very thrilled about running the economy hot. And it's pretty clear that the Liz Truss experience has terrified the Treasury for a generation. So actually getting the British policymakers, I haven't been watching, I've been with Andy trying to persuade the Treasury to take some risk. But right now, this is something we'd have to think about a lot, and particularly in what now looks to be a really pretty scary world. So the question is, what do we learn and what can we do? This is one of the big questions here.
It's also, I think one of the things which comes through the paper is you always, when you're looking at another country, have to look at the way people talk about policy from their starting point. So, you know, the Biden administration was regulating the labour market, empowering workers, backing a greater role for trade unions. But in fact, the story was amazing flexibility and dynamism. And because they start from a very different place. And if you start from a very different place and you want to learn the right lessons, you might need to look at the truth and the reality more than the language which people use to describe their policy. Shriti, that dynamism point, but more broadly, we say here, industrial policy, the scale of the American market compared to Britain, and our need to look to our other trading partners, the tech sector, playing to our strengths, prioritisation, the importance of competition policy, but also, as I think they tried to do, not having industrial policy levers which were not firm specific, which were available for firms. What are the things? Please talk about the dynamism point, but also more broadly on the industrial policy and the drivers of productivity picture. What lessons should we learn from the States?
I think on the dynamism point, just one last thing to add before we go on to the industrial policy, that I was really struck by Brian's point about the level of business creation, which will fail. It was involuntary business creation. It was sort of people thinking, oh, I'm sitting at home and I'm going to start a business, and the problem will fail. But, it was very recent for us that we had to change the rule that said, if you were the director of a failed company, you could sit on another company. I mean, by the way, we had to do that. I had to do that, and part of the Companies Act gave me a really hard time trying to change that. So, we have a different culture, and we just have to remember that is an important part of it. I think on the industrial policy, I think we're reasonably good at being neutral to companies. Historically, we have been reasonably good at being neutral to companies. We don't go in and subsidise. We'll put aside sort of cars and the manufacturing, slight fetishism, but
Steel.
And steel. But putting those aside, I think we're reasonably good at being neutral. What disturbs me a little bit at the moment is this sense that industrial policy has to be co-created with business, which by definition means existing business, which is by definition income. so this level of co-creation I'm a tad uncomfortable with. And I think that we ought to be having a much more sort of the dynamic disruptor competition approach to it. That I think that is an important.
Big business tends to say we don't like competition policy very much.
Well, I don't like competition. They're trying not to like competition. I mean, that's how it works. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that's their fiduciary responsibility.
And what is the government's responsibility?
Government's responsibility is to make policy regardless. I mean, they should listen. They do listen. That's good. But in the end, they can't be co-creating policy for business with business. It's for business.
How about the point Brian said about energy and kind of dynamism in industrial policy making? That it wasn't necessarily new, but they really went for it energetically.
Yeah, I mean, I think the government is trying. I think they've done some really quite interesting things. I'm delighted with the idea that they're taking on planning reform. Finally, somebody's taking on planning reform. I don't know if you remember how many times we failed it.
Yep.
About 3 years, I think it was. So that is fantastic. I hope they're going to be as bold as possible and focus a lot more on why we're not going to meet those housing targets or anything else. Delighted with sort of Heathrow and Cambridge, Oxford, Corona and everything else. They have to have the boldest version of that. For me, the boldness is really important. It was important before the turmoil that we we're going, for that, and now it is doubly so. And the thing that is, you have to be holistic as well. So was it in your report or was it a Mario Draghi report that said it's actually the differential is a lot about technology?
He said that.
Yeah. So the starting point is our universities. Larry said, focus on your fundamentals. The fundamentals are we have great universities and they are on their knees, and there is a funding model that is broke. And I don't see an enormous amount of, what are we going to do to fix that going on with that. When we talk about science and technology, we do have to talk about skills. We have an amazing opportunity, which is extraordinarily sad for the US, with an exodus of scientists and Nobel laureates and everybody else, and the attack on science and academics is really sad, but an opportunity. They should be here. I know 2 countries that have recruiters walking around these universities, getting them to come to wherever they are, and name them. We should have the red carpet out, and that's what we should be doing. We should have, I'm sorry to say this, we should have a much more dynamic and sort of intelligently permissive immigration policy when it comes to talent and skills, because we are in the end a small country, and I think that people are perfectly intelligent in understanding and differentiating between one type of immigration and another type of immigration, much better at than we probably think that they are. But the whole of the spending round is overshadowing this industrial strategy, I feel, because it's all couched in, can you give us big ideas, but can you make sure they don't cost anything? I'm like, I think that's a little bit tough. So that is a problem, because if you want to do a massive increase in R&D tax credit or improve its eligibility to one of the things that we are really good at, which is creative industries. It's a new sector, it's not a recognized sector, but it is one of the most innovative sectors that we have. They're not eligible for anything on R&D, but they, have one of the highest levels of R&D. So you can't cost anything because of the fiscal constraint. Well, then it's really hard to make.
But
it's really hard to make industrial policy in this situation.
really good. Martin, we also say that you've got to look to your biggest market on your doorstep.
Yes, well, I'm perfectly prepared to rethink that, but I don't really want the civil war it's going to start. But I could jump into it. Yes, I'd like to make a completely different point, which is we all wish we could create the sort of productivity growth that we've been seeing in the US, particularly in the last 20 years. And surely some of it is to do with the dynamism and flexibility and all the rest of it. But quite a bit of it must be to do with the dominance of the tech sector.
Yeah.
And you all know, I've repeatedly used the statistics on the value of the major tech companies in the US, none of which existed more than 40 years ago. Apple is a really old company now, some of it really not much more than 20 years, relative to the entire European stock market. And I had a discussion of this, actually dropping names, shouldn't do it, but anyway, with Paul Krugman, because I was interested in how he interpreted this. And his view, which I think I share, is the agglomeration and other economies of scale in this sector are so staggering that it is simply, I mean, basically there are only 2 players in this game, the US and China. And if you're going to create Amazon or Google or Microsoft or the next round of AI on the video or so forth, you've got to be in those economies because the network and other economies of scale are so vast. And that is going to be a very important advantage of scale. The Europeans are very sad, and this is a key point Mario is making, that they've never been able to generate a single market in this sense, and I suspect they won't. I wish they would, but I suspect they won't, because I think there are other features that make the US work. And Paul's point basically is the agglomeration externalities are crucial. It's that they're all in the same damn plate. Not quite. Microsoft is a little bit more, but you know what I mean. So what I wonder is, should we just recognize that Britain cannot do that? And therefore, we're not going to replicate this sort of productivity growth. And if we do this well, what we're going to do is create a lot of deep mines and arms and things like that, which are going to be bought up because they're the best we've done by the Americans. But we're not going to create domestic firms like that, and therefore we're not going to enjoy the extraordinary spillovers that these firms seem to be generating. Or is that just hopelessly defeatist? But it's something that what I think I will be very worried about is if our industrial policy, just take in the CHIPS Act, they basically decided we're going to move a big chunk of TSMC to America. Well, America's big enough to do that.
Yeah.
We're not.
No.
So we cannot do it in the way they're doing it. And they did it because similarly with the Green Road, America is so big, it can plausibly pull off getting from nowhere to a first-class world industry with for them, relatively trivial sums of money. We can't.
Andy, and then we'll take a couple of questions.
That is defeatist, Martin.
Yeah.
I know it is, but defeatist. Maybe 2 points, and they both flow actually from your paper, Ed. The first is about scale, where, I mean, if you ask me for what have we got wrong in public policy terms in this country over many decades, I think we have our diagnosis pretty much sorted and agreed. And often some of the solutions, the prescriptions, are well-meaning and directionally right. All we get wrong is where the decimal point is. In other words, a question of inadequate scale of intervention. I think you see that in industrial strategy now, where we'll be spreading a tiny amount of jam across 8 sectors with no hope on that scale of rising to the challenge we've been talking about right now. And even when we do talk about, indeed, to some extent, act big and bold, let's take the last budget. The biggest and most important part of that was Rachel committing an extra 100 billion over 5 years to public investment. 2 cheers for that. Why not 3 cheers? Well, listen, the starting point is the capital stock per worker in the UK is half that in France and Germany. And our investment rate is still several percentage points below that in those countries. So a massive gap is getting wider. All that did, that budget announcement, is to stabilise the investment rate, which remains below that of our competitors, which means the capital stock gap is getting ever wider over time. Good luck getting growth off the back of that starting point. The decimal point is in the wrong place. Yeah. Having argued strategy has been too wide, I'm not going to argue it's been too narrow. Because one of the benefits of not being a public policymaker is I can be completely inconsistent in my comments over time. We all know consistency is the hobgoblin of the small minds. If you take even those 8 sectors and look across the 4 corners of the UK, you'll find that they don't have anything to say to between 80 and 85% of the workforce. So what's the story for them? If we're in the game of inclusive growth for everyone, what's the story for the remaining 80 or 85% of the workforce? In healthcare, in social care, in hospitality, in distribution, in construction, in retail, and in the like. And the only way you will speak to the masses of the workforce and give them hope and lift their lives is to boost their skills. And so far, precious little, quite close to the square root of diddly squat, has been said about the skills agenda in this country. So alongside and very much complementing our top-down sectoral view on industrial strategy needs to be a bottom-up, skills-based approach to that strategy, without which inclusive growth cannot happen.
So let's just take 3. No, you can't. I think you can in your final remarks. Because I don't want to overrun too much and we've got to get to the drinks. 3 questions. Gentleman there, and come on. I know, I was looking for somebody who's not a man, but it's always a challenge. The two there. We'll take these two first. Ponder it. Gentleman here.
Thank you all very much for all of this. And I'm sure the dynamism point is really, really important. One side of this is, of course, labour market flexibility. So making companies terrified to hire people from day one might not be so smart. But another side of it surely has to be private investment, because if you've got lots of private investment, lots of scale-up capital available, people are more likely to change jobs, people are more likely to set up businesses. And to Martin's point, I mean, I know the arms situation really quite well for a long time. There is no reason why ARM couldn't have done every single thing that it has now done and remained a British company, other than the colossal stupidity of British investors. Even when it was bought by SoftBank, most of the Brits had sold out. But if you had a different type of investor who was prepared to make long-term investments, ARM could have flourished just as well on the public markets. Of course, it had most of its customers in America. It had essentially no customers in the UK. But we're a very good place to sell to things globally.
Very, very good. To the gentleman behind you.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations on a fantastic paper to everybody that's contributed. My question is about the place-based elements of Bidenomics. We've not really touched on that yet on the panel. A huge part of this was political and it was place-based, but not Bidenomics. And specifically, I'd like to, we've got an author of the Levelling Up white paper, and Ed, I know you've done some work on this as well, Anna Stansbury. Thinking about industrial policy, do you think the UK should focus on its port cities, which underperform, strengthen the knowledge economy, or should it go down the kind of secure-economics route that Rachel Reeves used to talk about, but we've not heard a lot recently, which is about reindustrialization, using the green transition and maybe defence to reindustrialise forgotten towns, particularly in the context of political polarisation that we know has been a big factor in the UK and in the US. So it's about the industrial policy and its particular place-based elements.
Perfect. Gentleman here. And then you had your hand up a minute ago.
I did, yes.
You can't change your mind. I mean, yeah.
A little bit similar to the point that was made earlier, sort of, and something I think Brian Deese was touching on is the sort of difference in capital markets, and obviously the US as a capital market that we envy very much. When I was in the US, I remember taking a class with Hal Scott on capital markets regulation, and him saying that approximately around the year 2000, they were terrified that capital would increasingly move to London from the US, and yet over the last 25 years, we've seen that absolutely didn't happen. So I'd just be curious about your reflections around the kind of capital markets component.
Very, very good. I'm going to take Michelle and everybody else happy? Go on, Michelle.
Understandably, of Trump's tariff policies. Clearly, he's not going to change his goal. Can anyone give him a way out to get to his goal another way?
Thank you very much indeed. So what we're going to do is we will go down this way from this end. You don't have to answer every question, but Andy needs to say something about place-based, and Shriti needs to say something about whether the investors are just too short-sighted and rubbish. And Martin, I think probably whether the UK has made mistakes and kind of and change that US to London dynamic. And but all of you need to end by saying, is any of this relevant in the Trump world, and is there a better way? And you got about 2 minutes each.
2 minutes each. Perfect. Thank you, Ed. So on the place-based stuff, there you are. Listen, the arithmetic fact is this. We will not meet our national growth mission, which is seen to be primus inter pares among the missions, unless and until we're able to have almost all parts of the UK firing growth-wise. Right? As an arithmetic fact, that is the case. So of course you need to make good on place-based growth. There is not an either-or between cities and what Rachel used to call the everyday economy. Different places are differently equipped. The Manchester model, the city region model, works really well for Manchester, but won't work for all four corners of the UK. And there's many more places that aren't Manchester-like than are. And that means a somewhat different approach, which is the kind of skills up approach across all sectors. I think it'll be really important for getting growth going everywhere, not just in our superstar cities. That will, without question, will require a proper devolution revolution. That was promised in the white paper last year, but not delivered in that white paper. We need to go much further on that front if we are to unlock the potential, which I know to be enormous, across all parts of the UK. Final point, which bridges on, everyone remember the programme Call My Bluff? And I'm old enough to remember that. And I think Trump is bluffing. And I think his bluff is being called on tariffs. I think he'll cave on them. He'll cave inelegantly and gracelessly, no doubt. He'll say he's wrung some concession out of everyone. But, you know, I think the self-harm that's been inflicted on the economy and on stock markets is not the thing he wants on his epitaph. And therefore, I'm optimistic side of neutral of that. I hope that's not wishful thinking. And on your final point, Ed, do I think, given that, whatever plays out, does that make irrelevant the lessons in your paper? I would say quite the opposite. Now is a time for even greater boldness, including galvanizing support across Europe, including around defence. I think there's a chance that the Prime Minister could catch a real thermal on the security defence agenda to use that necessity and turn it into a virtue in creating a jobs-rich growth across all four corners of the UK in a way that spans the skill spectrum. One of the beauties of defence is it achieves all of those things. Now then when?
Very good, Shriti.
I want to say two things about technology that gives me some glimmer of hope that you know, we can do this a little differently, completely differently actually. The first is of AI adoption. We have a fat body and fat tail of extremely underactive companies who have been historically very poor at technology adoption. And AI is a chance to fix that because of its apparent and potential ease of use. So we have to have a really strong AI adoption strategy. I'm not going to suggest to you that anything I've seen so far is giving me that, but I think we can get there if we put our minds to it. And that would raise productivity across the piece, and I think that would help. The second thing is, while we can't compete with the network effects of the big tech companies, first of all, AI is going towards a more intermediate or directed form of AI. That might work better for us. And secondly, what we have to understand we have, and many other countries have that we could work with together, trade union movement of countries, is that we have the data. We have the richest content and data almost in the world. We have 100 years of BBC stuff. We have extraordinary, because of the monolithic nature of the NHS, extraordinary health data. And we have to understand it has value and it is not to be given away free, as is proposed in some of the AI bill stuff that's going through. That is value, that is something that we have. And right now there's an asymmetry in the bargaining of providing that needs to be changed, and there are methods to change that. And there are other countries who are interested in changing that. On the point of capital markets, yes, we've had 4 or 5 centuries of financing risk, and now we finance governance, and I appreciate that that's the problem. And a lot of it is obviously related to the fact that we have a demographic and a pension, DB pension scheme that then comes into maturity, then that gets sold out, and then it's kind of, you know, you put it into gilts and then you go to bed. So, it's not doing its job properly, and that capital markets reform needs to have a much more concerted approach than I think that we have. I mean, we've had gazetted and the consolidation bits that are happening around the smaller benches seems as good, but we could go more further. On the point about Trump, I mean, if you get a few fake victories, that you can declare, it's possible. My sense of it, regardless of whether it's possible or not, the impetus on the rest of us is to find a way in which we're not going backwards, but that we are continuing to work together and liberalise ex-US, even if they kind of go back on, it's not that they're trustworthy. So whether it's Europe and, Canada and Indonesia and Malaysia, and there is a whole element of cooperation that has not been tapped on, whether it's digital and whether it's services, etc., that we can still work on outside of the US, and we should be doing that regardless.
Very good. Martin, we'll give you the last word.
Okay, I think I'll talk 3 points. First, savings, capital markets, so forth. Andy, like many other people, constantly talks about how important it is for us to raise our investment, and of course I agree with that. But he doesn't talk, and almost nobody talks about the fact that we are far worse on savings than we are on investment. And,
yes.
So let's suppose we were to raise our investment rate by a measly 3 percentage points of 3% of GDP, we would have a structural current account deficit of 6% of GDP plus. And I think the Treasury might quite reasonably be concerned about the counterparts of that. And that links directly with the fact that we allowed our savings system, our ludicrous so-called pension arrangements, to collapse, and we never devised a sensible replacement. And our consumption shares in GDP are correspondingly ridiculously high. None of us can, well, because I'm going to die soon, but many you people will not be able to retire. So the savings, pensions, capital markets things, all part of one thing. And the problem is that the only way to get from here to there is by suppressing somebody's consumption. And the people who have most of the consumption we'd like to suppress will say that they're going to leave the country on the following day. And some of them will. So that's a very big set of issues. Second, I think that whether Trump gives up what he's just done or half of it, whatever, it doesn't make any difference. He has created a radical uncertainty and radical untrustworthiness for the system and for the dominant player in the system. And we have to assume until he's dead and buried, and the MAGA movement with him, which probably won't be tomorrow, that this is the world we live in. And it creates nightmarish problems. But clearly the first part of solving that problem has to be to start cooperating very, very closely with Europe and a few other allies, Canada, for example, in dealing with, in creating alternatives. One of the most difficult parts of that, and it actually links with industrial policy, is what we do with China. Because there is going to be massive diversion of Chinese exports from the United States into Europe, and that will be the next trade war. That is not a possibility. It is certain, of course, it is certain. So cooperating with China is going to become very difficult. Final thing I was thinking about, the subject of dynamism and the subject of AI are two sides of one coin, it seems. If everybody is right in believing, I'm completely agnostic, that AI is transformative and will completely recreate our labor markets. If it does, then if it does, the labor markets have to be able to deliver the adjustments that are needed and the jobs that go with it in the midst of a labor market revolution, while the world economy is going to pieces. So it's going to take really high level policy making to get through that combination. And I have to say, looking at recent performance, I'm not infinitely confident that we'll pull it off.
Can I thank my co-authors, Kings and Harvard, for their support, Brian Deese, who was with us earlier, and in particular, Andy Haldane, Shriti, Vadera, and Martin Wolf. I hope you thought that was interesting. I thought it was fascinating. Thanks very much. And as I said, if you go